Hi, friends. Welcome to episode 27 of School Librarians United. I am your host, Amy Herman. This podcast is dedicated to the issues and challenges school librarians face every day. As a school librarian for 12 years and counting, I found myself asking the question, where is the podcast that will help me do my job? I wanted a podcast which addressed the nuts and bolts of running a successful library program. I don't claim to have the answers, but I hope that this is a platform to share resources and exchange ideas. Now is a perfect time to mention that the ideas expressed in this podcast are my own, or when appropriate, I cite my sources. So whether you are a novice or a veteran school librarian, this podcast has something for you. This week, I'd like to welcome Jennifer and her fellow school librarians from Alabama. Thank you, Facebook, for Tammy in Maine. I have never met a poet laureate before, but now I have. I'd also like to thank Daphne for reaching out to the podcast. Librarian Twitter is a wonderful thing. Daphne lives in New York, and is a self-described future school librarian. I asked her to describe her program, and she said, quote, "It is a program at Long Island University connected with the Department of Education. It happens to be every 2 years. Though it might end if the New York City no longer has a huge need for school librarians. The groups are called cohorts, and this is Daphne, is in cohort number 3. There are 15 of us. We just started in January. The classes are mostly online, but we meet in person once a month, and someone from the Department of Education is there as well as our professors from Long Island University. Pretty much everyone but me is already a teacher at the Department of Education, so they are well poised to start work in a Department of Education library. I am one of the lucky ones who gets to learn from them. We are required to observe in libraries, which I have found hugely helpful. There are some fantastic school librarians in New York City. Some folks will no doubt start at libraries while finishing the program. The need is great, and they will be well prepared. It has only been a few months, but we have learned so much." End quote. I wanted to thank you, Daphne, for sharing with us your path to becoming a school librarian. I'm aware increasingly, as times change, that our programs and how many of us became school librarians is becoming, different from the more traditional route that I took. I am also aware of a similar fast-track program which is now being offered through Wayne State University in Detroit. It is the only school in the state to offer an accredited library media specialist certificate separate of a master's program. The 15 credits versus the 36 which are required in the full master's program in library science. Enrollees must have a current valid Michigan teaching certificate. I'll attach a link to the FAQ page for any of our Michigan listeners who might be interested. So, when you have a podcast, you can pull up a fun and very distracting page which gives you a bunch of statistics on your downloads, as well as how many are being downloaded and which episodes are popular and where in the world all these downloads are happening. I mentioned last week that there are school librarians listening to this podcast in 24 countries outside of the United States. Turns out that 71% of the listeners are in the United States, while the bulk of the remaining listeners primarily are in Canada, Australia, the UK, New Zealand, and Guam. I do want to welcome everyone to reach out, either through Facebook or Twitter, or emailing me at schoollibrariansunited@gmail.com. Networking with school librarians across the country and around the world has been by far the nicest and most unexpected surprise. I will happily send you a podcast sticker if you include your mailing address. Planning episodes is a little reminiscent of creating lesson plans and generating a presentation for a conference. On the one hand, I've had overarching goals in each of the episodes that I'd like to address. On the other hand, I'm very aware that listeners, just like attendees at a conference, you're welcome to walk out whenever the presentation stops being interesting. So too can the listeners leave by switching to a different podcast. So I'd like to thank you all right now for choosing to listen to this podcast. Without a co-host, I can guarantee you'll be spared much of the off-topic banter, which will take up a great deal of time. I also don't have a producer or an editor, so I'm very mindful to try and keep as much of my episode pertinent to that of the school librarians and school libraries as possible. I did want to take full responsibility for instigating what at times seemed like a school librarian civil war a few days ago in a couple Facebook discussion groups. I posted this week that I loathed Wikipedia. I briefly stated why, and I included a link to the episode I recorded on December 3rd, Our Voldemort Wikipedia. My messaging alerts were so rapid fire, it became immediately clear that my post had sparked a very heated dispute. My first reaction was, oh, I need to apologize for posting such a contentious and divisive topic. But I reconsidered. A debate. When all participants keep their contributions thoughtful and maintaining a respectful tone is important to our profession. Why apologize for initiating a vigorous exchange of ideas and opinions? We need to challenge our convictions and widely held assumptions if we are to grow. One of the ways to do that, albeit remotely, is to conduct such a discussion with a community who has a vested interest in how Wikipedia is incorporated into our research lessons. At the end of the day, our utmost concern is a shared one, preparing our students to be critical users of online information. And now, episode 27. I've learned I still have a lot to learn. As I mentioned last week, the inspiration for this week's episode is the last season of Game of Thrones, which starts on April 14th. You neither need to have seen any episodes nor read any of the books to appreciate the message of this particular episode. Spend any amount of time binge watching your favorite show, and you will start to identify with some of the characters. When it comes to the Game of Thrones series, once you get beyond the brothels, the gore, the slaughter, you are treated to characters who are richly developed and a dialogue which is witty and biting. Fans see themselves in the shows, and I've got plenty of time to consider which of the characters I most closely identify. My first assumption was that all librarians would identify with the maesters. These are the keepers of information. They were valued members of each house and consulted on a range of topics. Their expertise was represented by different chains which they displayed draped over their shoulders, much as like a scout would earn badges in specialties. Each of the rival houses had a maester who chimed in whenever it was important regarding communication between the houses, strategy or alliances, illness, preparing for lean times, or impending winter. Maesters received their training in Old Town in the Citadel, and if they completed their training, they were dispensed out to the houses as the old maesters died. And this is where the prop department must have really been doing their homework, researching medieval libraries. A combination of scrolls and books are depicted for record keeping, and glimpses of these repositories of information have shelves of chained volumes. Lily Rotham, writing for Time magazine on July 17, 2017, an article titled Game of Thrones made it abundantly clear why medieval libraries chained their books. In a world, quote, like the real Middle Ages or fictional Westeros, with low literacy rates and scarce written material, a person who controls the knowledge holds the seat of power. Even within the hierarchy of maesters delineated by chains and keys, knowledge held as a secret to which only a privileged few have access, end quote. And historians were quick to point out that while the chained libraries were accurate, Samuel Tarley, who was training to be a maester, in reshelving these volumes was simply moving between the chains, bypassing the entire point of having them. These chains connected every book to a rod which was secured to the shelf. Books in a chained library were never intended to be removed, rather read in place and put back immediately. And it's not hard to imagine why so few of these chained libraries remain, as most of these rooms were lit by oil lamp or by candle. And when fires ravaged these places, it would have been impossible to remove these books quickly from their bookshelves. Lily Rothman quoted Robert Rouse, who teaches medieval literature at the University of British Columbia, quote, "I think it's kind of interesting if you think about the role of the maesters. The maesters themselves are all about the control of knowledge, and the books are part of that." Quote. Rouse also continues to say, "That is why they are valuable to society, so they guard that very jealously." End quote. The chained book, as he sees it, is a metaphor, and one that doesn't require any medieval studies expertise to understand. Quote, "Information is power, and when you hold information, you control the narrative." End quote. And that, my friends, is why I am glad that I do not have an editor today, because an editor would have cut that entire history lesson on medieval libraries out of today's episode. Anyway, are you a maester? Or possibly you are Jon Snow, or maybe Tyrion Lannister. There are days when I am Jon Snow, a member of the Night's Watch. He was repeatedly told in Season 2 by Ygritte, a wildling, "You know nothing, Jon Snow." There are days I'm convinced I know nothing. And then there's Tyrion Lannister, who decidedly delivers the best lines of any character in the entire series. He said, quote, "I drink and I know things," end quote. Because he's a halfling, a dwarf, he cannot rely on strength or brute force or wield a sword to save himself. Instead, he has to outsmart his opponents. Tyrion said, quote, "My brother has his sword, King Robert has his warhammer, and I have my mind. A mind needs a book as a sword needs a whetstone if it is to keep its edge. That is why I read so much Jon Snow." End quote. So, which Game of Thrones character do you most readily identify? Or do you, like me, spend my days alternating between knowing and knowing nothing? In episode 19, Podcasts and You, posted on February 4th, I shared with you my kryptonite. I revealed that I am very aware of gaps in my education, my general knowledge, and experience, which I've been trying to hide. Or, as has been the case in the past 5 years, given me a good reason to listen to podcasts, I've learned that I still have a lot to learn. And I'm continuously reminded of that fact. Versions of this quote have been attributed to Socrates, Einstein, can be found in the lyrics to a Tony Bennett song. Thanks to the nature of my job, my brain experiences an informational tug-of-war, vacillating wildly between knowing freakishly odd trivia and then not being able to spell basic search terms for my students. There is a dichotomy of these two extremes. How can I both know and not know at the same time? These polar opposites of knowing random stuff and then being completely oblivious to others are like two sides of the same coin. The public expects our answers on demand. We are not smart speakers like Alexa or Google Home. People expect us to rattle off information because, more often than not, that's exactly what we do all day long. Author Elaine Massicot wrote about the wisdom paradox in her blog. I'll attach a link in the show notes. Quote, "The wisdom paradox tells us that the more we're exposed to thoughts, points of view, new situations, cultures, ideas, and facts, the more we appreciate just how ignorant we are, and that the ways to see the world are virtually infinite. There's a hidden power in it. That power rests in the lack of assumptions." And she goes on to list, we stop assuming there's an easy answer. We ask more questions. We listen more intently to fully appreciate and understand a point of view. We realize that anyone and everyone can be a teacher. And this is Amy. I'm going to insert in here, this includes our students, as I am sure you have found yourself learning from your students as well. Finally, and Helene continues, we are more empathetic because empathy is difficult, if not impossible, when we assume others think and see the world the way we do. End quote. The wisdom paradox is not a new revelation, and I'm sure it's been called something else and explored by many academics. I did find this particular explanation most useful for the purposes of this podcast. So, there are days I feel like Jon Snow. I know nothing. We are all reluctant to admit our weaknesses. I described in a very early episode last fall that I didn't want my department to know just how clueless I was when I got my first job as a school librarian 13 years ago. Rather than ask questions, I struggled and undoubtedly wasted a great deal of time making many mistakes. I'm grateful now for the discussion forums on AASL and Facebook and Twitter chats because we can all reveal our questions in a way that we don't feel threatened or embarrassed. What I don't know, when I'm pinned down because I'm a librarian and I feel I'm regarded by some to be a walking computer. Is there a profession quite like that? I'm sure all professions have their on-the-spot requests when somebody finds out what you do for a living. Attorneys are asked for free legal advice. Physicians are asked for instant diagnoses. Physical therapists are expected to troubleshoot all your aches and pains. Priests and ministers are oftentimes asked to give impromptu prayers and blessings. And I'm expected to be able to rattle off titles and authors for any age or any interest on the spot. Because when somebody finds out I'm a librarian, they're going to ask me random book questions, and I'm expected to know about all books, including adult fiction, YA, and everything in between. And I feel like an idiot because my focus for now is elementary, K-5 literature, and even then, I don't feel like I know enough to say that that's my area of expertise. This past week was our spring break, and I spent a few days in New York City. I make it a point to go and visit the famous Strand bookstore. It boasts 18 miles of books on their shelves. You want to feel like an idiot? Walk into the children's section. There were all these brand new titles. How can I call myself a children's librarian and see so many books in front of me which I have never seen before? When you place 2 book orders a year, one in the fall and one in early February, and your budget is very modest, my library shelves will never look like the beautiful displays at the Strand bookstore. I left the store feeling defeated, woefully inadequate, and failing to provide my students with so many of the wonderful books which I saw that afternoon, and I had never ever had a chance to page through before. Have you ever heard of Nexo Nights? And when students ask you for books on Bionicle or Legends of Chima or Masters of Spinjitzu, do you know what they're talking about? Because I was clueless. And then you learn that Lego not only makes toys, but they make books to go with those toys, and every iteration which follows. Do you know which superheroes belong to DC and which ones belong to Marvel? Because apparently it's very important. I can't spell, and students who watch me accessing the OPAC for a book, a process which I make sure is always projected, for better or worse, on my smartboard for all my students to see, have proof. My students have learned that Mrs. Herman can type really well, and she doesn't have to look down at her fingers. They think that's cool. They also quickly discover that their librarian cannot spell. Hoping for autocorrect just doesn't happen on our OPAC, and quick spelling on Google can have disastrous results. Here are just a sample of the recent words which I stumbled over while looking for material for my students. Chihuahua, which forever now will be pronounced as Chi-hua-hua, and I can spell it. Great Pyrenees, another word I can't spell. Poinsettia, sapphire. Opossum, not to be confused with possum. Apparently, they are different animals. The word Odyssey, I've never been able to spell, never mind the fact that I actually drove one for 6 years. Eiffel Tower. Veterinarian. Dogman is apparently 2 words when you search for it, but blobfish is one word. Axolotl. Another word I can't spell right the first time is Einstein, not to be confused with Shel Silverstein, which is somebody different. I'd like to shift gears right now, because there are a lot of times when I feel like Tyrion Lannister. I drink, though not in front of my students, and I know things, really random things. I've been told I should be a contestant on Jeopardy. I've watched this show as part of my evening ritual for most of my life, and I really do enjoy quizzing myself. I've always balked, however, at the suggestion that I should actually become a contestant. I've even started listing some of the horrible categories of the questions I'd be stuck with if I ever made it onto the show. Categories such as Old Testament, Super Bowl winners, Canadian provinces, quantum physics, and Greek philosophers. Once I became a librarian, the assumption, of course, is that I'd be able to answer all the literary questions. And that's when I'm reminded of just how little I know. It wouldn't surprise anyone to learn that librarians do exceptionally well on Jeopardy. We excel at trivia. In fact, according to an article written in 2017 in the American Library magazine, an article by Ann Ford titled "The Badass Librarians of Jeopardy!" I'll include a link in the show notes. In the past 12 years, 150 librarians have been contestants on Jeopardy! At least 30 of them were champions, collectively winning over $900,000. Our knowledge base reflects all the projects and research our students have conducted over the years. Thanks to my students doing passion projects and Genius Hour projects 3 times a year, country expos, living museum, and bio buddies, persuasive essays, and research projects, I've encountered volumes of information, and by default, I've internalized a great deal of it. So recently, a video went viral of morning TV newscasters speaking to the Toledo public school students during their testing week. And I encourage you to see this. I've attached a link in the show notes, and perhaps you'll see why I thought this had some relevance to today's episode. Because we all work with students all day long, and many of you, I myself have 3 teenagers. I have been able to interpret about 80% of this podcast without any help. Recently, I did have to ask my own children what slaps and what whack meant, whether it was good or bad, and I have sometimes referenced the urbandictionary.com to make sure I understand the context of what is being said. Be sure to take a listen and see how well you do. In addition to slang, we school librarians have to be current on trends on TV, movies, popular singers, favorite athletes, YouTube stars, Instagram influencers, online multiplayer video games, and which social media platforms are fading in popularity and which ones are gaining. Musical.ly became TikTok, and every single title being offered at any Scholastic Book Fair being held throughout the year. My students seem to assume that every copy of one of those books will instantly appear in my collection, and while some of us are invited to pull products from a book fair, many of us elect to cash out and spend our budget elsewhere. It's incredibly validating to be able to help someone, whether it is a student at school, a coworker, or a fellow school librarian on AASL, Twitter, or Facebook. It's exciting to jump into a posting and to show off what you've learned over the years of, been there, done that, and I feel your pain, and you're not alone. By the same token, while in these forums, we're just as likely to see the other side of the coin, to get a glimpse of what I don't know. And there are postings where I have nothing to contribute, no experience, no knowledge base. So I'll look at the comments offered up by others. Sometimes I'll take notes. I appreciate being able to consider all the suggestions offered up by school librarians with expertise in that area. We forget, just because we're at home in our libraries doesn't mean others are as well. We can orient ourselves quickly, much in the same way that folks on vacation can orient themselves in a grocery store they've never been in. Librarians move through fiction and nonfiction with the ease in any library, and that is sometimes something we forget. Our familiarity with how libraries are organized gives us a foundation that enables us to move in easily to any library setting. On a rainy day, visiting my mother on Marco Island in Florida, we made use of my mom's library card, and I ended up, as I often do at home, in our public library, offering assistance to random patrons who were around me saying things out loud to their children like, "Ooh, I wonder if this library has this book." And they're always surprised when I can show them exactly where to find the book, but I tell them I don't work here. I'm actually a librarian in Michigan, and our libraries are all organized the same way. I did want to highlight some very generous contributions made by 3 school librarians. Jennifer, an elementary school librarian in Kentucky, said she feels really smart and capable when students can check the online catalog and find a book they want on the shelf independently. She says she feels clueless when somebody asks for her help solving a middle school math problem, and she sends them to the correct website for help. I am right there with you. There's a reason why I never taught math, I just have to say. Jamie, who's a high school librarian in California, said she feels smart and capable when hanging out with her students, and she feels clueless when using Destiny, that she can use it just fine when she's practicing by herself, but never when she's working with someone else. And I think there are all of us who have been able to find things easily when we're sitting by ourselves in our office, and as soon as we have an audience, it doesn't come up. Caroline, an elementary school librarian in Illinois, said she feels smart and capable when teachers ask her for help with a lesson or a unit, and she's able to breathe new life into it, either with a book or a fresh perspective or something she learned from her PLN. On the other hand, she feels clueless when her younglings in her cohort start talking about an app or other form of technology, and she's never heard of it and has no clue of its purpose. She said it's dreadfully humbling and makes me feel so inept. Lastly, I do want to reserve space in this discussion for what happens when my students teach me. I'm reminded when I listen to various EdTech podcasts that we don't have to be the expert all the time. Technology teachers, and oftentimes as the librarian that responsibility falls to us, requires that we let ourselves be a little vulnerable and let the students see us learn on the spot. That's very important. Learning from our students and in front of our students, IRL, in real life is important, and they are informing our own learning every day. So let's bring this all together. One of my favorite classes in library school was access to information. I found it empowering. It reassured me that we don't need to know it all. We are not expected to know everything, just the best place to find it. I found this wonderfully comforting, that we as school librarians are resources independent of our library. That doesn't mean we can't use a database or search for something online. Quite the contrary, it means that we can do the searches with accuracy. And as Neil Gaiman reminds us, quote, Google can bring you back 100,000 answers. A librarian can bring you back the right one, end quote. I want to thank everybody who's listening today, and especially to those who contributed to this episode. And just a reminder, when you're messaging on Twitter or Facebook or emailing the podcast at schoollibrariansunited@gmail.com, please include a mailing address and I will be sure to send you a sticker. The topic of next week's episode will be graphic novels, preaching to the choir. I hope you will tune in.